everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Bottom Line. I'm your host, Lauren Kalil. Our show is brought to you by Vuori. I have an unhealthy amount of joggers, but Vuori's performance joggers, they take the cake as the most softest, comfortable pants. Make sure to check out the description below for 20% off of your first purchase. On today's episode, we have Brian Friend and Tyler Watkins here to discuss how using the CrossFit methodology can help build games predicting stats. I can't believe we're already just about a week away from the games, and you two, along with James Hobart, J.R. Howell, and Taylor Self, you guys developed some sort of system to help predict the results without even knowing the game's programming yet. So, Tyler, I want to start with you. How did you start developing this system, and what exactly is this system if people haven't seen it yet?
Yeah, the question's always going into the games. We don't know most of the events before, we're already a week out and we don't know what any of the events are. So how can you create power rankings like Brian does? How can you predict as events come out? And so I've been thinking about for years how to break down events based on a few criteria, and I had to use a couple pros' help to develop those. So that's
Brian,
that's what I was after.
What were some of your contributions to developing this system with Tyler and the other folks?
No, I think, Tyler's doing the most of the legwork here, and then he's just calling us as each of one of us has different kind of areas of expertise, or a lot of times it's not even that we're necessarily adding something, it's just an affirmation, or it's giving him an additional thought that pushes pushes against what he's trying to do so that he can maybe try to answer some of the hard questions ahead of time so that it doesn't have to deal with them on the back end.
Brian's being modest.
It's like all of the best brains in CrossFit come together to help make this more interesting, especially for the fans. And we have so many different power rankings. We hear who are people's, podium or beyond the podium, or even Brian and myself and a couple other people did the 1 through 40. But the two big components that you guys were looking at were time domain and then modality components. I want to first touch on the time domains. What were they, and why did you guys ultimately choose these specific ones?
Yeah. A few people throughout the years have been trying to break down like the different time domains, and a lot of people have done it like based on pure numbers, 0 to 3 minutes, X to Y. But the feel of those time domains is more of what matters more than anything. So basically what we have, I pulled this from Harry Pally. Now, I don't know Harry, maybe you guys know him, but he wrote for Comp Train for a long time. Now he works for Hard Work Pays Off, and he laid out a system where it goes, I'm going to go up in time domain. So it goes sprint, threshold, pacer, and grind workout. Now, pacer and grind workout are very similar in time domain, but grind, it happens to be heavier. So this is like the flip burden run from the 2014 games. That was a long pacer event, but because it was heavy, it's a grind. So we can split workouts into these different categories. And then so James Hobart added this mostly to our system. He added max strength. So these are events that are not for time, max lifts, things like that.
Why add these time domains? Brian, go ahead.
Well, for me, you can just look at last year's games as an example. So there were out of the 15 tests, there were 6 of them that were basically between 5 and 10 minutes. And so you could say, oh man, that's a lot of tests. It's 40% of the tests in a 5-minute window. Why is that happening? But if you just looked at the last 3 workouts on the final day, all of which fall into that time domain, and if you can't remember what those were, it was the yoke workout in the morning where there was a little bit of a buy-in with the GHD and the hay bale. That was like a sprint reset style workout. And then the second workout was the deadlift freestanding handstand push-up, which for basically everyone was just a skill component. So even though it was a similar time domain, the feel of the workout is entirely different. And then the final, you have a mostly irrelevant row into a big set of chest bar pull-ups and then the challenging lunge. And so even though most people are finishing in that same time domain, the stress on the body is different from each of the 3 workouts. So that's like a very easy and familiar example from last year at the games that can personify where not all 7-minute workouts feel the same.
Right.
So the second component that you both looked at were the modalities: gymnastics, metabolic conditioning, weightlifting. Anybody who's programmed for a gym or themselves before, they are familiar with this. But just to kind of give us an understanding of what falls into each category, this is what you guys came up with. What do these look like when thinking of who is going to place where? And is there any crossover?
So I think a lot of people have forgotten about this component of the level one. And it was great to kind of pull this back. And Brian, this is the part that I wanted to talk about that Brian added mostly. So all of these are in every CrossFit event most of the time, or a combination of these movement modalities are in any event. But what we asked particularly were what was the crux, what was the limiter of the workout, which movement had the most effect in challenging the athletes. And so those workouts will get a distinction in gymnastics, metabolic conditioning, or weightlifting. And so that was how Brian challenged me to classify these workouts.
And as far as the crossover, I think that if you're programming or assessing programming, you have to keep in mind that some of these things become aerobic as the athletes become better. So everyday person in the gym, I would consider a wall ball to be a weightlifting component. They're moving an object through space, and most of the time the limiter is shoulder fatigue, assuming they can squat well. But when you get to the professional level, especially if you're talking about a 20 and 14 pound wall ball, it's just an aerobic movement. That's not a challenging weightlifting for them. It's as long as they can go while maintaining their breathing. And so as a programmer, you need to be conscious not only of what the movements are, but also the group that you're programming for. And then on the back end, when we're analyzing it, we can look at something at the CrossFit Games or a semifinal level, and we might say, man, it looks like there's a little bit light on monostructural. However, there's a big group of movements that we would call gymnastics, like an air squat or a regular pull-up or a burpee, that for those athletes is very much an aerobic challenge, not so much a gymnastics challenge.
So then I want to get to, for those who are not science, math peoples with formula, y'all are going to have to break this down. Sorry, we're going to scroll to rate here. The performance rate equals a formula. Can you break this down in a beginner first grade language?
So you're jumping ideas. So now we have a way of talking about breaking down any workout we want to. I think we can get more complicated, but at a base level, these two distinctions, these two classifications are very useful when breaking down a workout. And then I thought, well, if I can break down these workouts, I already have a sort of power ranking that I've learned that I developed how to calculate overall. So this performance rate is how many times an athlete finishes first through 10th. Those are multiplied by a multiplier, first being 10 all the way down to 1 for 10th, divided by the number of events performed. Now, the number of events performed is the part that matters here. So if we want to know who does the best in gymnastics only workouts, we look at all those workouts and say, how did Tia do in all of her gymnastics workouts? And then how many times she finished first.
That's where what Tyler said earlier matters, is so that it's not obviously there's workouts that are more than just gymnastics in them, but when gymnastics is the limiting component of the workout, then we would classify that as a gymnastic workout for a number of gymnastics events that Tia has done.
Right. So what this does is creates a power ranking for each one of these modalities or time domain. And so you can use these going into the games to say, okay, Brian and I will probably text back and forth. What is this workout limited by? That was the fun part with Taylor and JR. They disagree all the time on what the programming was, what the distinct limiter was. But we can go and we can text each other and say, okay, what's the limiter on this? And then based on that, if it's gymnastics, okay, who has the best gymnastics rating?
Okay,
so that's how it's useful for viewers when they're at the games. Okay,
is that how you came up with this?
Yes.
Okay, so explain this. Is it a ranking out of 10, I assume?
You can get a max of 10. All of these individuals are scored individually or separately. But yeah, your max score can be 10. So Tia right there has a 8.92 on weightlifting events. Which
is insane.
Right. It is absolutely ridiculous. And so what we can expect from her is, if this is a weightlifting limited event, it is likely to see Tia, Laura, and Gabby in the top of those. And we usually see that. If you want to combine that with the time domain piece, it can often make that clearer. So it looks at all the events over the past 3 years and says, okay, what fits into this category and what can that predict for me?
So why ultimately create something like this? Is this to add more excitement to the sport, allow fans to play along? Do you think that it's dumbed down enough for people like me who like maybe get confused with formulas? Like, what was the ultimate goal here?
Well, so like Morning Chalk Up now has a pick'em thing. And even though
Yep.
they did this before the games events were announced, if they did it after the games events were announced, you could use a tool like this to develop your picks. Fantasy Fitnessing has their own
Mhm.
fantasy app. I've been working on and developing my own fantasy app for a year. This is going to start crawling into the sport. You're going to start seeing fantasy pull into the sport, and it's a way to talk talk about it as a viewer and as an analyst, where it's easy to understand who's got the best chance going into this workout. Well, based on my analysis, this person.
Yeah, and on the back end, when we're talking about this and trying to come up with the concept, we go the opposite direction and we go super granular because we recognize that in a particular workout, the limiter might actually be different athlete to athlete, and so that's really hard to conceptualize
Mm-hmm.
when you're trying to make a formula like this. But we can look at the general field and we can say, well, a majority of the athletes were limited by the muscle up here. And obviously there's some that are super proficient in the muscle up, and we know that, and they're not as strong. And so they were limited by the Husafel bag or whatever it is. So we can see that there can be some shared limiter capacities in certain workouts, but you can always dive deeper and deeper. This kind of zooms it back out and says, like, on the grand picture scale, and especially when you look at the top three in each division, it's not surprising Tia pops up at the top. You see Vellner
Yeah.
come in third and first on the weightlifting and gymnastics, and he's not on the board in monostructural. And everyone pretty much knows why, is that he's had one or two workouts in major events that are of that time domain that have, so he's not in the top three. And so you can see just at a more basic level, it's going to give you a general idea. This is the modality, weightlifting, monostructural gymnastics, that this person is best, average, and worst at in the events they've done. It doesn't take into account strength of field and other variables that we're still kind of toying with and playing around. How can we actually quantify those? But it's a really good starting place for people to look and say, oh, wow, Haley Adams is amazing at this. She's okay at this. And that's where she needs to make her move.
Another. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Tyler.
Well, another, like Brian hinted about this, another way it's really useful, even if you take the athletes out of it, is every year or every semifinal, every event, people say, well, the programming was really this. It was really long or it was really heavy. And so it's now we have a way of stating that, with numerically. And so it's like, until you make these categories, yes, these categories are sort of high level, but until you make them, you can't really talk about it in any meaningful way. So now we have a way of breaking down the programming every year, and somebody saying, well, the programming was really aerobic. Well, did we see that? Is it more aerobic, more or less, to other competitions?
So at what point will I see you guys, maybe the rest of the group, create brackets like we see for basketball March Madness, where we have a games bracket and people can actually fill them out? Like, are we getting close to that in CrossFit?
I thought about this about a week ago. I was like, we need to make a bracket, but I don't know any of the
Yeah.
events yet. So it's like Medeiros versus Vellner in this event would be really cool. Who do you have? Well, we don't know any of the events ahead of time, or else I would make that.
Right. And Fantasy Fitnessing has done elements of this with the Open, where you can
Mhm.
choose like a head-to-head matchup. But again, you're choosing blind. So, you can say like, well, usually in week one of the Open, this is kind of the limiting thing. So I'm going to go with this athlete. But you don't know if an athlete like Lazar Jukic is going to show up and just totally mail in the entire Open. I mean, he did absolutely terrible in the Open. It's not because he wasn't fit. It's because that's not a priority for him. And so then, there's a lot of variables that are left to be desired, potentially. So absent knowing the programming, yeah, there's going to be limiting stuff with those kinds of competitions, but this is creating a baseline and a framework within which people can start to conceptualize athletes' performance relative to each other and in different styles of workouts that I think eventually can lead to some pretty cool stuff.
Yeah, I like adding the fan aspect to it too, and we're getting there. I like the baseline that you guys laid out here. Tyler, what would you say your bottom line is?
Bottom line is, I mean, at the end of the day, these are just numbers, and people like Brent Fikowski prove me wrong every single year, no matter what the stats are. But at the bottom line is, this is an easier way to talk about the sport. It develops a framework for talking about the sport.
Brian, what's your bottom line?
Tyler and I have been working on this for most of the year. We've done a lot of test type scenarios with different out of competition or out of season competitions, in season competitions, and then we're going to do some evaluations at the games. And it's really cool to see that process evolve. And I'm just hopeful that it does get to the point where it can be digestible for the casual fan as well.
Love
One
to
more
see
thing,
that.
but Brian is so much better of an analyst than I. So, people who are like me, who can't just have this broad recall of whatever, these are stats you can follow to make it easier. And so I have to engineer my own way to catch up to Brian whenever I can.
We need both of your brains in the space. Trust me. Well, thanks, guys. I really appreciate it. Brian, Tyler, we'll see you guys in Madison.